Hey folks, David Stewart here. Here are 5 things that writers can do besides read books to improve their craft. Now, as a little bit of a preamble to this, if you are a writer of books, you need to be a reader of books. I think this Stephen King quote is something like, if you don't have time to read, then you won't have the time or tools to write. So it's very important to be experiencing your craft as a book writer, seeing how other people write prose, how other people execute dialogue, how other people execute various story things on the page. There's really no replacement for that. But here's 5 other things that I think can tangentially improve your writing in ways that are a little bit more subtle than just reading books. So the first one is actually things that people try to do instead of reading books, which is watch movies, play video games, read comics, and manga. So the reason that this is not a substitute for reading a book is that you're missing all the prose and the dialogue, and these things don't necessarily transfer to other media accurately or fairly. So a movie, though, still has a story to it. And so it has a conflict and a resolution. It has characters. You can see them. But it's doing all of its transmission of ideas through the video and the audio aspects. You won't be... if you're trying to write like you're trying to write a movie, you'll not include things like smells, feelings of your skin. There's so much extra stuff you can do with prose to describe what's going on besides just the visual audio experience. So if you're just describing visual acts, then probably it's going to read like books or movies, and that's not what you want to do. You want to have lots of sensory information to really enhance the scene. You can't communicate thoughts very well in movies because you only have dialogue. You just have the dialogue and then the audiovisual information. But it still has story that's being executed. So if you're watching a movie, that may give you more ideas for what kind of story you want to execute, what kind of things you want to do in a book. The visuals may inspire you. Same thing with comics. Comics are a little bit closer to books, but you're missing prose. So you're not getting that information for how to write your prose accurately, but you are getting some dialogue. Comic book dialogue does not translate that well into book dialogue because you write comic book dialogue, particularly American comic book dialogue, in some different ways with like accents and stuff on the words that you would never really do in prose. And you're missing still a lot of that information about how maybe like the tone of the voice or things like that. You could still have narrations in comics and then you have visual information, but the visuals might inspire you. If you're reading a manga, you may see a really cool panel, you may like the design of a character, and that may inspire you to think about how you want to do something in your book. So that can work. And video games are probably the worst medium to try to transfer a story into any other medium, because video games are really about the gameplay. And the story tends to be something that moves you through various set pieces, not so much something that's like an executed plot like in a movie. But you may get inspired by the visuals or the dialogue or the way characters act or interact, and that may make you think about how you'd like to do something different in a book. So yes, you can do things, experience stories in other mediums, and that will still give you ideas, but they are not replacements for reading a book. But moving on. You can study history. So this is number 2. Studying history, I think, can give you a lot of perspective on how other people in other cultures think, operate, act. Other people in other times think, operate, and act, which will help your characters to be more realistic, to be more thoroughly influenced by their setting. So if you're setting a character in the 1920s New York, knowing how people in the 1920s New York think, acted, cared about, that's going to matter. So studying the history of the United States during that period, that's going to be helpful. Likewise, if you're writing fantasy, like European or medieval fantasy, of course, it's helpful to know European medieval history, arms and armor. How did knights put on their armor? What kind of armor did they wear? What were their unit tactics like? How did they fight battles? How rich were knights? What were castles like? What was the landscape like? What was the relationship between lords, and what was the relationship between kings of various kinds, between peasants? Who were the thrall and who were the noblemen? Knowing all of those little aspects of history, if you're going to write fantasy, is very, very helpful, because we tend to think of fantasy universes as being somewhat analogous to some period in history. So in the case of like traditional European fantasy, we're thinking like it's going to be like European history. I've also done Japanese historical fiction, so obviously you have to study the history of Japan, and in my case it was set in the Muromachi period, late Muromachi, really, I mean, bordering in the Sengoku, like 1511. And so I have to know a lot about what was going on there, who was shogun, what's the relationship between how powerful was the shogun, what's the relationship between him and the Kanrei, like, and what's the society like, how do people live, how do samurai live different from peasants, and things like that. So all of those things inform the book that you're writing, and that could be research for a book, but just in general, knowing how people's environments, how the place that they were born, the culture that they grew up in, how that affects their outlook, their mindset, what they think is possible and impossible. It's really informative if you're writing in any kind of genre, whether it's historical fiction or fantasy or anything else. So studying history can give you a lot of ideas. Likewise, it can give you ideas even for science fiction. Here's how the Roman Empire fell. Oh, I'm going to think about this for a galactic empire. What were the things that might cause a galactic empire to fall? Well, let's look back in history at the things that caused other empires to fall. So it will inform your writing in a very tangential way, but a way that can really enhance it and enhance its effect more than just the execution of prose. Number 3 would be to take martial arts and fencing, kind of related to this. Like you could take HEMA, learn to compete in HEMA, and of course you're going to have a very good idea of how swordsmen happened to operate their tools. So if you're writing about, knights or something, or maybe you're setting it in the Baroque period and people are still using like rapiers and daggers, knowing how those weapons operated and how you actually fought with them will help you describe them accurately. If we go back in time to the pulps, like 100 years ago, Robert E. Howard used to go out and like practice with spears and things like that to get an idea of what it felt like to use the weapons so that you could make an accurate description of the character. There was even genres that existed in the pulp period that we wouldn't even think of being literary today, which is like boxing, describing people boxing in a literary sense. People didn't have TV. They couldn't watch boxing matches. So you had to know a little bit about how boxing worked if you were going to write a story about boxing. You had to have stepped in the ring or like trained as a boxer a little bit to know how that's going to work. So taking some time and learning martial arts can directly influence that, and it can do it indirectly. If you take, for instance, I don't know, jiu-jitsu or a grappling sport, you have at the very least you have an idea of how much physical exertion gets involved of trying to fight another person or grapple with them or just having a physical contest with another person, just how exhausting that can be and how much energy it takes. A lot of times, and I'm not going to say I'm immune from this, but you tend to write heroes and stories that are infatigable, and it's better to have a great idea of how fatiguing it is to actually fight other people because that will influence how you want to construct your story as well. So all those things will give you ideas for how to write fight scenes or what a character is going to feel like if they're in a physical conflict. So studying martial arts or fencing, those are I think can be a really fun activity. And there's a lot of writers that people really like who've done that in various capacities, who have studied martial arts or HEMA or something like that. And I think that can influence their writing in a positive way. Number 4 is studying a foreign language. This is important again for the same reasons that you study history, is that language can affect the way that we present to the world and the way that we think about things. For instance, if you were studying Japanese, Japanese is often considered a complex language because depending on who you're talking to, you'll speak to them in a different way with a different set of words or even refer to them with different things. So the social relationship between people is very influenced by the language, and the language is constantly reinforcing that. That's something that you won't get unless you learn the language a little bit. And likewise, if you're learning, say, Spanish, how the collection of how different words influence how people tend to think about them, their concept of what words they maybe use that are analogous for love and how they're maybe different from your language. You learn that through learning the language, and so that can give you a lot of different ideas for how other people think and to create characters that maybe are interesting in ways that you wouldn't think of if you hadn't learned that language and learned how those languages affect people. And likewise for fantasy writers, to know that foreign languages do things very differently from English if you are a native English speaker is very helpful. And if English is your second language, you've probably learned a lot by learning English as your second language, and you probably have a lot of lessons that you know from your home language. Some words don't go into English. They just can't be translated properly at all. Likewise, some words exist in English and it's very difficult to try to bring them into another language. So understanding these other things gives you some insight to new concepts that you may never have thought of otherwise. Number 5 is actually to learn another artistic discipline, music or say visual arts. Learn to draw or paint. Learn to play a musical instrument. So this can help you in a couple of ways. First of all, it can be inspirational. If you learn to draw, I think visual art in particular can really enhance your writing because it gets you to think of forms differently. It gets you to pay attention to details differently, which in turn can help you paint a scene better. It can help you to draw the reader's attention to the right traits at the right time to give them the correct sense of what a character is supposed to look like or how they're moving, how they're acting, how they're presenting. So visual art in particular can do that. Music can just enhance your general ability to describe music or to talk about sound and things like that. Through that experience, through understanding, say, music theory, through learning to perform on your instrument, and all of those things that go along with that. So those are all things that I think can help writers. All 5 of those things, besides just reading books. But if you're not taking the time to read the books, you need to also read some books. Okay. So thanks so much. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You can find more by my books over at dvspress.com, and I will see you guys next time. Have a great one.